Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2 and the 8th mission of the Semper Syria campaign. The Marine spearhead is now rapidly approaching the city of Homs. Resistance from the Syrian 5th Airborne Regiment has crumbled and the pressure from the Marines thrust up Highway 3, and the US Army's advance from the east across the desert has smashed the Syrian 4th Mechanized Division. With enemy forces beginning to disintegrate, Marine and Army units are seeking to coordinate a link-up northwest of the city. Link-up Point Delta sits at the junction of two diagonal roads, with the V-shaped area to the north filled in by a series of tower blocks. These are well spaced out, with plenty of open ground and parking areas between them, as well as some walls. That whole area is almost entirely flat. In contrast, the area outside the V to the west and east is much rougher and covered with palm trees. Point Delta is an Occupy objective worth 1,000 victory points. The Marines are approaching from the northwest, with checkpoint Tango in between them and Delta. The Army is running a little late and will appear in the northeast, again with a checkpoint Whiskey, between them and objective Delta. Both of these checkpoints are touch objectives worth 50 points. In the centre of the map is the local Ba'ath Party headquarters, a 6-storey building. As well as linking up with the army, we've also got orders to search this for intelligence. In game terms, that means occupying the building for another 500 points. Also on the table are 100 points for minimising collateral damage, up to 500 for destroying the enemy, an extra 200 for inflicting more than 70% casualties on them, and a final 300 for keeping US losses below 50%. The Marines are starting off with their LAV platoon on map, backed up by a couple of Humvees, and supported by a platoon from Force Recon, which has gone ahead dismounted into the rough ground west of Delta. After 5 minutes, C Troop 425th Cav will arrive in the east. This is a US Army Recon platoon mounted in Strikers. A little later, after 20 minutes, a pair of Marine Abrams will also appear. In support, we have a section each of medium mortars and 155s. The Marine supply lines are starting to get a bit stretched now, and the howitzers have some limited ammunition. On the plus side, the weather has improved, and after 25 minutes a pair of AH-1W Cobras will come on call. Against this, the enemy doesn't appear to be pushing up a conventional force. The Recon Marines have spotted a platoon-sized force of enemy combatants among the buildings, but it's possible that fragmentary Syrian mechanized forces will make an appearance, as the overall situation is quite fast-moving and confused. So in short, we have a small-scale urban warfare mission ahead of us, and my efforts to avoid urban warfare completely have been fatally compromised. On the plus side, this is a relatively simple urban area with lots of open space over which I can exert the Marines' considerable firepower. A key component of fighting in urban areas is, maybe counterintuitively, dominating the spaces between buildings and restricting the enemy's freedom of movement so that individual elements can be isolated and destroyed in detail. Enemy positions that could cover Point Delta essentially boil down to the tower blocks lining the west road. These can already be engaged by the forward deployed Recon Marines. If the mounted Marine elements get off the road and shift to their left into the buildings at the other end of the road, they should be able to create a fire corridor that runs behind the potential enemy positions and isolates them. From there, they can also dominate the north and west faces of the Ba'ath Party HQ and the open ground around it. When the army platoon arrives, they should be in a position to exploit any advantage. If they're not enough themselves, the enemy should at least be located and fixed so that the Abrams can roll up and delete them when they arrive. Nice, simple stuff. I'm really aiming for a hands-off, firepower-centric approach for this one. There's an hour on the clock. The map is pretty small. From the Marine deployment zone it's only 300 meters to Point Delta and 250 to the Ba'ath Party HQ, so I should have plenty of time to try and shoot the enemy out of their positions. Actually moving in and trying to storm occupied buildings is my last resort here, not my go-to. Starting off, the Force Recon Marines hold position under the palms and eyeball the buildings ahead of them, while the rest of the Marines spread off the road to start setting up those fire corridors. There are no contacts, not even after getting scouts up onto the upper floors of some of the blocks to look down into the centre around the Ba'ath Party HQ, not even when I send a Humvee forward to touch checkpoint Tango. With the buildings opposite the recon marines clearly unoccupied, I decide to split off a scout team and send them forward to try and trip any ambush. A couple of LAVs and the Humvees look on, in position to provide some oblique supporting fire if necessary, but they make it without any problems. Something must have triggered though, because on the next turn the enemy wakes up. The first sign of this is a combatant team that runs out of one of the buildings in front of the Ba'ath Party HQ. They're rapidly shot to pieces by all the marines on Overwatch, but more contacts start popping up. For the scout dismounts and the LAVs, this means it's open season. The force recon marines are in a slightly less envious position. With a pair of men already across the road and up against the wall under the corner tower block, I have a choice to make. Those two marines are really exposed over there, but safe for now as the corner block is clearly not occupied. But the now active enemy might go for it. I either need to pull back across the road and potentially cede the corner block to the enemy in favour of maintaining a stronger position in the palm trees, or follow up with the rest of that force recon squad and make sure that I grab the corner block before the enemy does. Enemy access to the block from the centre is via the open ground and a gap in a wall. I'm confident that a squad of recon marines can hold them off, particularly with supporting fire from the scouts and LAVs covering the centre, so I decide to punch forward and grab the building. On the next turn, as the recon marines start to run, enemy contacts start popping up on the other side of the block. Turns out I don't have as good a view over the rear of the corner block as I thought. The uncons win the race into the building and open fire as the marines reach the central partition. For a few seconds it's touch and go. The lead squad has been caught out in a horrifically exposed position, but the second squad and the platoon HQ are there to back them up. The uncons emerge onto the upper floor balconies and shoot one of the marines directly underneath them, but accurate fire and grenades from across the road quickly shuts them down and wipes them out. I've gotten away with it. With the other marines blasting more uncons that have made the mistake of revealing their positions around the Ba'ath Party HQ, things are looking pretty good. The army, meanwhile, is having a slightly different experience. They arrived a few minutes ago and I haven't actually done very much with them. I had originally envisaged them as the manoeuvre element that would exploit the fixing effect of the marines, but the lack of early contacts has made me pretty cautious. The recon strikers in this time frame don't have remote controlled weapon systems, so the gunners have to open up to operate their M2s and Mark 19s, and the scout teams carried inside are not only just 5 men strong, but can't be split down into smaller sub-teams. These are both problems in an urban fight, degrading survivability and flexibility respectively, and without having a good handle on the enemy's positions, I was reluctant to push too far into the slightly denser clump of tower blocks closest to the army. Instead, I dismounted one team and edged them forward along the road using a high wall as cover until I could touch checkpoint Whiskey. This didn't generate any contacts, and when the uncons burst into action in the centre a few turns later, they seemed to be very much flowing towards Objective Delta, away from the army and towards the marines. This seemed like a good opportunity to exploit. With the highway and adjacent buildings apparently clear up to at least CP Whiskey, I could percolate onto the flank of the Ba'ath Party HQ and take advantage of some gaps in the walls to get the strikers off the road. With this in mind, and the recon marines getting stuck into their firefight next to Point Delta, I brought up another vehicle, kicked a second squad out to push forwards, and backed them up with the first squad and the platoon HQ. Then, one of the marine scouts in the buildings on the other side of the map spots a BMP. I've been so tunnel visioned on my objectives and the urban environment that I haven't secured my flank against the threat of external enemy forces mentioned by the briefing. The first BMP balances out this mistake by stopping where 2 of the strikers can see it through keyholes in the road wall, and they mercilessly colander it with their 50s until they hit something important and it detonates. There are already 3 more following it up though, rushing forward as if they're going to cross the east road by another gap and reinforce the Ba'ath Party HQ building. This is pretty dangerous. The strikers might be able to dish some damage out to the BMPs, but there's only one Mark 19 and the 50 cals are only going to be reliably effective against the BMP's side and rear armour. They certainly can't take any return fire, and with exposed gunners, they might be a burst of coax away from being neutralized. The dismounts are in an even worse position. The two teams up front have already missed with their single AT4s and they're exposed in the open. The lead team can at least put the high wall along the road between them and the BMPs, but the other is sheltering against it from the tower blocks and totally exposed. They need to move. Worse than all this is the reality that the army scouts here have a devastating anti-tank capability. Each striker carries a javelin and some reloads, but that capability isn't a lot of good if no one grabbed them before they dismounted. Again, my attention was wholly on the urban area up ahead, and I consciously did not pick up the javelins because I didn't think I was going to need them. In other words, I've screwed up. The first thing I should have done when the army elements arrived was set up a solid foothold, but I was too focused on how I was going to tackle the Ba'ath Party HQ. Now I have to scramble to avoid a minor disaster. Luckily, I'm not too far forward, and conveniently this puts me on the flank of the Syrian advance. As the scouts dash for cover, one of the strikers detonates another BMP with his 50, and the Mark 19 spews grenades into two more that react by turning their frontal armour onto the strikers and reversing away. I don't think they've actually seen the army vehicles though. The strikers are just about tall enough to be hull down behind the walls, and the gunners are evidently hard to spot while they fire over the top. More BMPs cruise up to the wreckage in the centre, one getting bogged and coming under fire as its dismounts bail, while another cruises past before panicking and reversing back into the beaten zone to add more chaos. The strikers are, perhaps surprisingly, doing a good job of chewing up the BMPs, but the Marines are on their way to help out. I already had one LAV rushing down to get a better angle on the corner block and support force recon. As soon as the BMP showed up, I ordered it right down to Objective Delta and sent another one after it as backup. As they come online, they pop one BMP with 25mm cannon fire before riddling another as it tries to get away. With their immediate armoured targets taken out, the LAVs quickly switch their attention to some resurgent uncons in the corner block and shred them in short order. That's 6 BMPs neutralised in 2 turns. There's one left that manages to escape the traffic jam and get onto the east road. For some reason, it stops to kick its dismounts out. It's not impossible that the Syrians are having second thoughts here and go into a panic, and they find themselves side on to all 4 strikers. The Syrian infantry are gunned down and the BMP knocked out in a hail of 50 caliber fire and 40mm HEVP grenades. 3 turns after the BMPs first spotted, they're all out of action, and the surviving crew and dismounts flee into the rough ground to the south. With that little interlude sorted out, I can refocus on the Ba'ath Party HQ. Point Delta now has the LAV sat on it, and I'm able to bring the rest of the Force Recon platoon across to occupy the corner block and the adjacent building. There's only minor resistance from another Uncon team beyond that's quickly snuffed out. The army, meanwhile, starts to get itself reorganised. The lead team that was already across the east road moves up, joined by the platoon's support team. This was already carrying an M240 GPMG, but was still mounted when the BMPs arrived, and has picked up a javelin as well. These 2 teams occupy a tower block overlooking the HQ objective through a keyhole, as I bring the other team and the platoon HQ round to join them. The terrain still feels a little too close for the strikers, so I initially keep them on the road to work the cutoff should the enemy flee south, but after spotting an Uncon RPG team hanging around on the ground floor of the Ba'ath Party HQ, I send the Mark 19 striker up to try and discourage them. This proves to be another lucky decision. As the striker heads off, the javelin-armed team on the top floor of the block they're heading for spots a tank to the south. It's a T-72 AV, rapidly joined by 3 more. For the second time this battle, I have to deal with the realisation that I've been caught out. I went straight back to thinking about the urban fight, didn't pick up the other 3 javelin launchers, didn't replenish or stock up on extra 84s, and left the strikers exposed on the east road, where they are too far away and too exposed for the infantry to quickly hop in and grab some anti-tank weapons. And unlike the BMPs, the strikers aren't going to do much against tanks. So it's brown alert as the T-72s hair up towards the road. The javelin team manages to take one out, but the strikers ineffectively plink 50 caliber fire off from the lead tank, before popping smoke at the end of the turn. This at least gives me a little respite, and luckily the Mark 19 Striker is now within easy reach of a squad that can loot it for anti-tank weapons, but this isn't looking fantastic. The Javelin team has given its position away and cops 225mm high explosive shells, losing the team leader and getting pinned. The first T-72 to reach a gap in the wall is engaged by the LAVs at the other end of the road, taking some 25mm AP penetrations to the side. These don't appear to do any meaningful damage, but they do at least discourage the crew. Then the first tank is across, absorbing 2 AT-4s from the Javelin team on its explosive reactive armour before parking up just beneath them. As the Strikers have a bit of a panic in the palm grove I sent them to hide in, the Javelin operator finally gets his weapon back in the fight and nails a second T-72. Good news, but it's their last missile, and the tank right underneath them proceeds to blow the entire team away in response. That leaves 2 T-72s, both of which have now crossed the East Road and are standing by to overrun the army dismounts and the Mark 19 Striker. The only other team equipped with AT weapons, including another Javelin, has piled into a nearby building, but the closest T-72 pins them with its coax at point-blank range, shrugging off a 40mm grenade from the other team in the process. While all this is happening, another mass of infantry contacts has appeared on the other side of the map. Arriving behind Force Recon's initial position, what looks like a platoon of Syrian airborne has joined in to spice things up for the Marines. Unfortunately for them, they're quickly spotted and find themselves overlooked by multiple teams of angry Marines that all but wipe them out as they try to advance. That's no consolation to the army though. They're in a terrible position, and I'm sure it's only the somehow unspotted Mark 19 Striker popping smoke that saves them from getting pulverised by the remaining 2 tanks. Blinded by the smoke, and without any targets to distract them, the T-72s move on, rolling towards the centre of the map, and the open ground and fire corridors dominated by the Marine LAR dismounts and their conspicuous lack of effective AT weapons. The lead tank rolls into the middle, only to come face to face with a Marine Abrams coming the other way. The Marines are faster on the draw, and the T-72 is knocked out with a single hit. The Abrams have literally only just arrived 3 minutes late, and I've thrown them forward to intercept a possible push from the T-72s. The second enemy tank emerges from the smoke to find itself staring down the barrel of the other Abrams. The 120mm AP FSDS shot goes straight through the upper front slope, out the back of the T-72, detonating the ammo load in the process, and finally being intercepted by a tree only a few meters away from one of the Strikers by the East Road. That takes place right at the end of the 23rd minute, and the Syrians immediately surrender. A surrender means that it's a total victory for the Americans. I've lost 6 men in total, 1 Force Recon Marine and an entire Army Scout team. The enemy have sustained exactly 100 casualties, along with 4 T-72 AVs and 7 BMP-1Ps. The only enemy unit remaining in the centre of the map is a 4-man Uncon RPG team on the bottom floor of the Ba'ath Party HQ, a team that I was aware of and would probably not have offered meaningful resistance given the firepower I could bring to bear. Everything else still on the table represents the shattered remnants of the Syrian counterattacking forces, survivors from the BMP company and the airborne platoon. And to some extent I think this sums this mission up. I was very much focused on my objectives all the way through, securing Point Delta and the Ba'ath Party headquarters, but these were defended by poor quality unconventional forces that really didn't offer any meaningful resistance. The real threat here was the external threat posed by the Syrian armoured and mechanised components, elements that I constantly sidelined while I tunnel visioned in on my objectives. I didn't do some basic stuff with the Strikers and army dismounts because I was standing by to plunge them into an urban area, and that really set up the 2 big screw-ups of the game, being caught out first by the BMPs and then by the T-72s. On the one hand, American quality and manpower and technical overmatch combined with terrible Soviet-era equipment and poor training on the Syrian side to mitigate the punishment that I deserved in both of those cases. On the other hand, Having 4 javelins ready and waiting to deal with the counterattacks could well have trivialized them. Treating the striker scouts as a substandard maneuver element in an urban environment, instead of a serious anti-tank element that I could use to cover my flank, was a mistake that I managed to make twice. But that said, this was the most fun I've had playing Combat Mission for ages. Small scale, quick to play, a few curveballs that I missed and plenty of interesting decision making, great stuff magnified by the tension introduced by my own mishandling of the situation. With that though, the Marines and Army have successfully linked up at Homs. They will evidently go on to occupy the city amidst the disintegrating Syrian defence without too much trouble, because in the next mission we're punching south down Highway 5 towards Damascus. Hope you all enjoyed this one and found it interesting. If you'd like to watch these videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.